Welcome back to another video with me, JD. We have finally made it. We finally made it to the point where I actually divulged the secrets of fantasy and how we apply them to SuperCoach. It's definitely been a bit of a journey to get here, so thank you for sticking with me through it. I know getting through buy planning and history of SuperCoach and fantasy isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I promise you the learnings that we'll get from it will help this year, and that's what we're about to go through. We're going to start by recapping why Guns and Rookies have died, which is really the end of the last video. So if you couldn't get through it, hopefully you'll get the main points out of this. Then we'll go through the implications for both the changes this year when it comes to SuperCoach, as well as what I've learned for fantasy. And finally, we're going to convert that into the 4 or 5 different strategies that I see playing out for next year, as well as my verdict of how I rate each of them. If you disagree, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. And I'm more than happy to test that logic and see if it holds true. You may find things that I've made assumptions that are completely wrong, but let's get stuck into it. So firstly, recapping, why did Guns and Rookies die? So for those that watched the previous video, you'll know that SuperCoach and to a lesser extent Fantasy have changed from limited trade formats to much heavier trade formats over the last 10 years. SuperCoach at one point had as little as, I believe, 20 trades, then went to 24, then 30, and then eventually we've now got up to 40 this year. So it's almost doubled really from when it began. When you had so few trades to create a side for the year, you really had to place emphasis on getting to an upgraded side for that period of time, and that meant you couldn't afford any injury or speculative type trades. So it wasn't guns and rookies necessarily, it was durable guns and rookies that were really valuable. And if we think about where mid prices come from, which is really the thing that guns and rookies leaves out, they come from 3 main areas. So they either break out through to natural development, they improve kind of in year, and Sarong was an example of that from last year. They significantly change roles or change clubs or both. So probably the most famous example of this would be when Tom Mitchell moved from the Swans to the Hawks. Brody from Gold Coast to Freo recently is another good example of that. And then lastly, you have those that have a significant injury discount coming into the year. So for example, James Sicily and Jared Witts in 2022 as well, really good examples of that. And when it comes to, are these players durable or are they going to be season-long picks? This is the reason I think where Guns and Rookies really neglected these types of players. So that first type of player in natural improvement is the hardest to pick of any of these 3, and many a season has been lost chasing those. So just very low hit rate, high chance that the pick fails and you'd have to move it on anyway. The second type of pick is a little bit easier in that if they've moved clubs for a better role, then it's quite easy to spot. But one thing that we kind of take for granted now is all the track watches and information we have on sites like Twitter and Big Footy, where you've got people going down, watching what's happening at training, and then reporting that back. You also have media playing a bigger role in reporting on this and showing more interest in the preseason as well. But previously, they didn't really have that. So actually picking that players had changed roles was much harder to do. And once again, that meant it was a speculative pick, likely to need a correction trade if you made a mistake. But we've got better at that more recently. And then the third one is that injury discount, so a Sicily or a Witts. And these are usually the easiest way to find a player that has upside because they've got demonstrated history of performing well in the past. But these come at the highest re-injury risk because they're just coming off an injury more often than not, and that's when you have the highest re-injury risk rate. And so once again, these players weren't durable. So you can very quickly see why Guns and Rookies avoided mid prices, because the best mid prices come with really high risk, and those that weren't as risky from a durability perspective weren't necessarily guaranteed to actually be good value or worthwhile pick, and you couldn't really afford to waste one on these types of players. And that is really what the difference has been as we've been able to add more trades. We can amp the risk up in our sides, take on more of these risky prices, as long as that risk is adequately compensated by creating additional value and points and cash for the risk that we are taking on. And as it turns out, it does, and that is why value-based teams have been more and more successful in recent times. And as we increase the amount of trades that we have, that is only going to continue to be more true. And One other question or sub point in this, you may be asking, well, why is it that a mid-price team or a team that has more mid-prices actually ends up scoring more? And from what I've quickly looked at and calculated, my belief is that a mid-price team has less rookies in it, which makes sense because you might cut down a primo, turn it into two mid-prices, and then you get rid of a rookie as well. And when these sides have less rookies, the rookies that they cut tend to be the worst ones. And if you think about the 30th, the 29th rookie that you have in your team most years, these are the ones that don't generate a lot of money anyway. They may get stuck on your bench and end up not being worth that much anyway. So for example, from last year, if you had Davey, if you had Constable, these are two rookie type picks that ended up making no money and not many points for you. At least Constable barter for the first couple of weeks. And so these mid-pricer teams are cutting these types of rookies that aren't useful anyway. Now, the other thing that they do is end up having an extra mid-pricer on field, or at least a couple of mid-prices, and push a rookie onto the bench. So generally, the worst rookies they have on field are your best rookies, and they are not playing the 22nd best player that you have on your side. So they're getting a little bit of a points-wise edge on that. So these Guns and Rookies teams can actually be outscored by the mid-pricer teams if the mid-pricer teams are constructed well, and they end up generating more cash. So generating both more points and more cash. And the thing that held them back in the past was that you end up running out of trades or not being able to create a side with good enough premiums is no longer true because you have the additional trades to actually complete a side. And that is my thesis on why Guns and Rookies have died. So moving on to 2024 and the changes that have made. If you watched the last video, once again, you saw the full list of all the changes that have gone on over periods of time. But I wanted to break it down into just the 4 changes that I think actually matter the most for this year. And that is what is on the screen in front of us. So firstly, as we've already touched on a lot, we're up to 40 trades now, up from 30 even a few years ago. And my prediction here, so on the right-hand side, we've got my predictions kind of in orange and then the strategy or what they may mean for how you manage your team in white. And this is based off my fantasy learnings. So for the extra trades we now have, I believe trading will more or less mimic fantasy up until the end of the buys. And I've written in white how I conceptualize fantasies 3 different periods throughout the year. You can think of them as roughly a third, but the actual weeks don't work out perfectly to be that. But the first third of fantasy is all about finding value. You are trying to generate as much cash from your team as quickly as you can. And it's not just rookies, it's not just mid-prices, it's your primos too. You want the whole team value to go up as much as you can, as quick as you can during that period. Now, at some point during that, towards the end of that first period, we need to start converting the value, the cash that you've created into points on field. So you want to be harvesting all that bench money, getting it onto the field. And that is the second part or the second phase. It is converting value into points on field. And that is traditionally what we would see as like an upgrade season. It's a lot of that is going on during that period. And then the last part, which is the part that I don't think we have to worry about in SuperCoach, which is good because it's the most painful and probably the hardest part of fantasy, is kind of optimizing. This is the last handful of weeks post-buys where you've got a full primo or thereabouts teams, and you are just trying to sideways players that you think have better schedules or better run homes and all that type of stuff. And it's not great. Don't love it. The first 2 parts of the game are actually what I think is most fun. And I think that is what SuperCoach is going to mimic this year, because we more or less have enough trades to do what I think 2 trades every week, and we go to round 20, you add in a few buys and you still make it to round 18 before you run out of trades. And that is really that value and point sections of fantasy. So we're going to be doing all of that. I think we missed the optimized part. And so what does that mean? Trade very aggressively early. Jump on any players whose price you see as rising quickly. You need to create that value as much as possible early on before converting the value into points. All right, secondly, pricing here. So pricing, of course, hasn't changed for SuperCoach, hasn't changed for fantasy either, but there is an interesting quirk with how the games work this year, and that is that we have obviously 8 teams playing that round 0 game, and that round 0 game prices don't move forward, but it does count towards the moving average. And it does count towards that qualifier. So normally it is after 3 rounds in SuperCoach that we have the first price rises for those that have played all 3 games. But this year we're going to have 8 teams worth of players, actually, sorry, 6 teams worth of players because of the bye, move after round 2, so a full round earlier than what we've had in previous years. Now, these players actually can unlock a different strategy of having an extra price rise by the time they get to their buy in round 5 or 6. And that could mean that we actually start upgrade cycles a little bit earlier than what we have done in previous years of SuperCoach, because effectively those 6 teams worth of, or actually by that point it comes down to 4, but those 4 teams worth of rookies have had additional price rises and could basically unlock an earlier upgrade cadence than what we've had in previous years. So that is very interesting kind of adjustment or second change here. Thirdly, we're going on to trade boosts, which is one of the still unique things between SuperCoach and Fantasy. So being able to activate that boost and get an extra trade in those weeks. Now, we figured out last year, actually we figured out basically since they were introduced, that the optimal way to use these trade boosts is during that upgrade period to utilize them during that time to upgrade and get additional premiums faster than you otherwise would be able to. Or if you had an injury, obviously you can move out that injury, but not be put behind on upgrading so much. And that is still going to be the strategy for this year. You want to be using these boosts aggressively during that upgrade period. Now, the one thing I've left off here, but is absolutely still true as well, value is the most important thing. When can we get value in this game? After round 1 and round 2, before prices have moved, you can be boosting at that point if you need to make corrections. I could see people using a full 6 trades in those first 2 weeks if it means fixing up their side. Totally for it as well. But we'll be boosting hard and fast in this game. And then lastly, we're going to go into this in the strategy section a little bit more, but as far as starting sides, I don't think by flipping premiums is worth it. Like, just don't start players to flip them, and it's just not a good move. Because we are focused on that value generating part, anytime you're taking trades to not create value, but to create points, I don't think it's worth it. You end up getting more points from the value you create later on. So the focus will still be on generating cash for these early buys, spending time doing sideways trades, no good. And so if you end up liking someone who is value, still just pick and plan to hold. So if you think Walsh is 20 points underpriced, for example, that'd be a lot of points, but say it is, you should pick him and start him and hold him. That should be the plan. Don't try and pick him in and get cutesy after he's buying all that type of stuff. You don't want to be sideways trading, you want to be creating money. All right, now moving on to other fantasy lessons that I've picked up and how to apply, and these are more like rules of thumb that that I hear other fantasy coaches talk about or have seen or picked up myself, and what it means for SuperCoach as we move more towards a fantasy style game. Firstly, on injury trades, how many weeks does a player need to be out to be worthwhile trading? In fantasy, I will see people trade any injury, especially if there's a risk that it is longer than 1 week. For me, I still believe that if it's 1 week or less, you should hold. That's not a consensus move in fantasy circles, but I don't like how it can affect upgrade cadences. So if I've got good moves, I would rather hold an injury player for a week than move them on. But yeah, the large implication here, and it comes back to us saying on the first page there, is that you should not be planning to buy flip players. If you have a player that is injured for 1 week, you hold them. If you have a player that is not injured and has a week of rest in a best 18 week, you should definitely never, ever trade them. So buy flipping, big no-no, don't do it. All right, secondly, trade targets. And this is a little bit different to what super coaches would normally do. But one thing that you see in fantasy is when there is a mid-pricer that is at great value and they might have changed position and you can see that they'll make a decent amount of money, it is totally okay to bring in these players in the middle of the year. This is not something you see super coaches doing. But I believe from this year, you could see more of it and it works successfully. There have been examples in previous years, like, I mean, even last year, if you bought Bailey Humphrey, who wasn't a true mid-pricer, I take it, but had gone up in price rises. If you jumped on him, it still ended up being the right move. You had a few years ago where if you got like Tex Walker and rode him for 3 weeks, it ended up being very good. I can see these types of moves becoming more popular. They are riskier in Supercoach than fantasy just because of how pricing works with 3-round average versus 5-round average. So you can have a bad game and it weights more and all that type of stuff. But I do believe this is more viable than what it's been in previous years. All right, keepers, a very common question in Supercoach and still in fantasy as well, is how many keepers should I have on my side? Now, the term keepers, I think, can be debated, but effectively, these are players you plan to pick and hold for the full year, and it's usually based on price. As far as I go, I have never counted how many keepers are in my fantasy side. I think I do it too much in Supercoaches because it's what the community does. I'm going to try and stop looking at the number of keepers I've got this year. I just want the cash to go up. I want money up, money up. That's all we care about. So I'm not too worried about that. For example, in my fantasy side last year, I think I would have been lucky to have more than 2 or 3 players that started that had north of a 100 average the year before. So they were all cheap, all under 900K for fantasy, which I guess is kind of like 500 or 550K and below in Supercoach. So really no one over 600 or pushing higher up than that. And so I just spread lots of these cheap value discounted guys and get the cash. And I think that's totally fine. Now, it is still worth paying up for a couple of big guys, maybe especially in Supercoach where the ceiling's a little bit higher for some of them, just to make sure you've got a captain and vice captain option, and especially if you don't like other options on the line. But yeah, the big point here is not to count keepers religiously like we have in the past. Just find that value no matter where it comes from. If you end up with still like 13 keepers, great. But I could also see teams with 10 or 11 being totally fine with the trades we've got this year, as long as you're picking good mid prices. Now, counter to what I just said, the new buys actually strengthens guns and rookies a little bit, but I actually don't think that it matters that much because all the other changes, especially the extra trades, still outweighed by the value kind of based strategy. So just quickly, why do the new buys strengthen guns and rookies? So it just comes back to what I was saying earlier for why mid-price strategies ended up being better, which is that they knocked worse rookies off the field. Now, in rounds 2, 3, 5, and 6, when we're going to best 18, you're cutting 4 rookies off the field anyway. So the guns and rookie side that might have been fielding slightly worse rookies kind of doesn't matter anymore because they're not counting towards your best score. And of the 18 that you have left, the guns and rookie side will have more premiums. The value-based side will have more mid-prices, and you can actually find that when you've got fewer players like that, the gun side actually can end up scoring more. So look, the buys slightly then swing it back to guns and rookies being stronger than previous years, but I still think that's outweighed by everything else that we've been discussing. Lastly, top price plays, and I've kind of touched on it already with the keepers, but basically don't start them, don't trade them in. I don't know how many times people have chased players because they had like 3 or 4 good weeks and now they're at the top of their price cycle. They trade them in, and of course they can't keep up that form, so they go backwards. There are exceptions to the rule, don't get me wrong. There have been years where like Gorn or an English or whatever have done that, and you should have just got on them while they were high because they kept going higher. But more often than not, you see these guys come back to the pack at some point. Even Bont, who had a phenomenal year last year, got up to ridiculous prices, and if you're paying over 700K for him, ruins your season. You still need to be finding value even as you're upgrading. So you're looking for keepers, top line premiums that have somewhat of a discount. The big moves last year that actually mattered, picking up Merit cheap, picking up Petrarca cheap. It wasn't getting Bont at 700K. That doesn't help you. And this comes back to starting sides a little bit as well, which is that these top price guys will not win you the year. I don't think anyone that picks Bont in fantasy for 700K, for over a mil, and same with Supercoach over 700K, he's already at near his top price. Maybe he goes a few points higher, but he's not going 10 points higher, 15 points higher. I'm going to bet against that all day. If he does, so be it. But those types of picks, so they can't really win you because they're not going to have much upside, but they can lose you if they have injuries, if they go backwards, all that type of stuff. We saw it a little bit with Laird last year as a pretty good example. Doherty is another one who's like that as well. So you're trying to avoid these top price guys because they can hurt you big time, and there's really not that much upside in getting them. All right, so finally then, the strategies, I'm just going to recap them that I can see kind of playing out this year and whether I think they're good or bad. So starting structure, do you go guns and rookies or do you kind of go a value-based approach? I think guns and rookies is a losing strategy this year. You want to go more value-based. Now, that doesn't mean force value everywhere you can or like just go crazy. That is not what that means. It is making calculated decisions around finding guys that are underpriced that can well achieve that and stacking your side with them in a way that makes sense. So if you end up with a structure that has 0 keepers, like you've probably done it wrong, because it also means you probably haven't got good rookies and all this type of stuff. Like just, yeah, not good. Now, the big discussion for strategy this year has been around picking round 0 players. So, as I've already touched on, buy flipping, picking players to buy flip, like buy flipping Green into Walsh. I think this is bad strategy, wouldn't do it. Should you still be picking players from round 0 that are very good value? Yes, absolutely. So for me, I think Flanders is great value. He is almost locked in to be a top 6 forward in my mind. It sounds like he's going to get that mid-roll, and there's really not too much competition at this point. So I'm going to start him all day. It does not matter that he's got that buy to me. I will find a way to make that work. Now, as I touched on, we've got a niche little strategy here, or niche, depending on how you pronounce it. I don't know. I'm sure there's got to be a correct way, or maybe it's just like American versus UK. But anyway. And so for this strategy here, for rookies that are on the round 2 bye, which is Carlton and Brisbane, they're the two. So who we got? Fantasia as an example, or Bins. You can not start these guys. Watch them for the first 2 weeks, round 0 and round 1. And if they look really good, you can pick them up coming off that round 2 bye. Now, at the same time, you've got 6 teams rookies. So all the others like the Swans, Gold Coast, GWS, Collingwood, Melbourne, and I've either missed a team or doubled up, but whatever, Tigers, I don't think I mentioned them. So you've got those 6 teams worth of players that will have had one price rise at that point. So they might have gone up 50, 80, 100K, or they may not be a very good rookie at all and only gone up 20K. But you can correct on that round to the round 2 rookies that you may have missed that are on buy. This is like a very, as I said, it's a niche thing, and you'd need to find the right rookies and all that type of stuff. But keep an eye on that. That is something that could play out and be a slight, small advantage this year, maybe even a reasonable one if it's done well. And then the last possible advantage that we have as well off these round 0 players is a somewhat similar concept, which is those that are on the round 5 and 6 buys. So that is Sydney, it's Sydney, Collingwood. I want to say it's Richmond, and I cannot tell you the last one off the top of my head. But players from those buys, it's Melbourne is one of them. Melbourne's one of them. So players from those buys will be 1 round ahead in price rises, because once again, they start a round earlier because of round 0, all the way up until they have their buy. And then once they have their buy, they end up having played the same number of games as everyone else. But because these rookies are a price ahead or a round ahead in price, it means we will have potentially enough rookies that have created enough value by that period of time to start upgrading our premiums in SuperCoach a round earlier than what we would have previously. And with our boosts, that makes it even more possible. So for rookies from the round 5 or 6 buys, they are worth targeting if you think they're good, simply because you could execute this strategy with it and start upgrading a week before everyone else, which ends up being huge as it snowballs throughout the year. So that is a good strategy if we have the rookies for it. Don't force it, can't force it. But look for them, including mid prices as well, because this could end up being one of those things that determine winners from losers this year. All right. Thanks for joining me. That is my recap of, fantasy learnings combined with the changes this year and how I think it plays out, not only in SuperCoach, but then how it interacts with the different strategies that we have. Let me know below if this has changed your mind, if you think I'm wrong. Otherwise, it should give you a pretty good clue as we get closer to the actual start of the year, how I'm going to start structuring up the sides and how I'm going to start making some decisions around which players I do or don't include. But yeah, as always, feel free to hit me up below, and I'll see you in the next one. We should be getting back to some, I guess, more regular content soon. I do like doing the strategy content, but it's a lot more work and effort to prep these up and set up for them, and I just don't have it. But it has been good to get through this, and I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.